The cursor stopped blinking. Not slowly, not hesitantly. It froze, mid-screen, as if something had been interrupted without warning. The agent didn't speak. His hand stayed on the mouse, perfectly still. The quiet inside the insurance office didn't feel accidental. It settled, heavy, invisible, the kind that draws attention without announcing itself. I noticed the way his shoulders squared before he lifted his eyes. Across the desk, my husband leaned back in his chair, comfortable, one arm draped loosely along the side as if this were a routine errand. He didn't seem to notice the pause, or maybe he expected the system to keep moving the way it always had. "I already canceled her policy," he said calmly, filling the silence before it could linger. "We don't need it anymore." The agent nodded, fingers returning to the mouse. A soft click, another. His eyes stayed on the screen. "Yes," he said evenly, "I see the cancellation request." He didn't look at me. There were other people waiting behind us, a man holding a folded document, a woman scrolling through her phone, an older couple standing close together near the wall. No one spoke, but the shift was subtle and unmistakable. The conversation had narrowed, and I was no longer inside it. My husband smiled faintly, not openly, just enough. "She doesn't handle insurance matters. I take care of everything." The agent accepted that without question. "Understood." He angled the monitor slightly toward my husband, away from me. The glass divider caught a faint reflection, but not enough to read details. I could still see the cursor, though, motionless, right where it had stopped. I stayed quiet. On the desk lay a tidy stack of documents: policy overview, cancellation confirmation, payment history. The top page showed a familiar sequence of numbers, my policy number, printed neatly near the corner. Beneath it, the coverage amount. Below that, the cancellation timestamp. The date stood out. My husband tapped the desk once with his knuckle, light but deliberate, as if prompting the process forward. "We're just here to make sure it's fully terminated. No loose ends." "Yes," the agent replied. "Once a policy is canceled, coverage ends immediately." He said it plainly, without emphasis. I watched him reach for his pen, then pause. He glanced from the screen to the document, then back again. The movement was small, procedural, not concern, not curiosity, just verification. My husband leaned forward slightly now, forearms resting on the desk. "Everything was submitted online," he said. "It should all be there." The agent nodded. "I see the submission." He scrolled slowly, methodically. The cursor moved again, then stopped. His expression didn't change. "This policy," he said, still neutral, "is listed under a single primary holder." My husband didn't hesitate. "That's correct." The agent's pen hovered above the page. "Cancellation requires authorization from the policyholder." "Yes," my husband said, without looking at me. The agent's eyes dropped to the lower section of the document. His finger rested briefly near a blank line. "I'm not seeing that authorization here." The space behind us felt closer. The older couple went quiet. The woman with the phone looked up, then quickly back down. No one said anything. The low hum of the lights overhead felt louder than before. My husband shifted in his chair. "It was included with the request," he said. "Maybe it didn't load." The agent acknowledged the comment with a short nod, then returned to the screen. He didn't rush, he didn't apologize, he simply checked again, scrolling with the same measured pace. "I see the request, I see the policyholder name, and I see the signature field." The cursor blinked once, then stopped. I folded my hands together, resting them in my lap. I didn't turn toward my husband. I didn't need to. The room felt different now. Not tense, not confrontational, just no longer compliant. The agent straightened the papers, aligning the edges carefully before closing the folder. "This file," he said, "will need a secondary review." He said it the way procedures are announced, without judgment, without explanation. He closed the folder, not sharply, not forcefully, just enough to signal that the process had paused. My husband opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the folder, then back at the agent. "How long will that take?" he asked. "It depends. Until the review is complete, the cancellation isn't finalized." He placed the folder beside the keyboard, not back in the stack. No one spoke after that. The people behind us pretended not to listen. The screen remained unchanged. The cursor stayed where it was, still and unresolved. I stayed there quietly, watching the system stop where it wasn't supposed to. And for the first time that morning, nothing moved forward. Not because I objected, not because I interrupted, but because something inside the process itself refused to proceed. The agent didn't look at me when he spoke next. His eyes stayed on the screen, then shifted back to my husband as if I wasn't part of the conversation at all. "So just to confirm," he said calmly, "the cancellation request came from you?" My husband nodded once, confident, casual, like this had been settled long before we walked in. "Yes," he said, "I already handled it." The agent accepted that answer without question. His chair turned slightly toward him, not me. The screen angled away from my side of the desk. I noticed how quickly the process reorganized itself around that assumption. I stayed quiet. The agent continued explaining what happens when a policy is canceled mid-cycle: coverage gaps, liability exposure, medical costs not retroactively covered. His voice was measured, professional, neutral. He spoke the way someone does when they believe they're talking to the decision maker. My husband leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "She doesn't handle insurance," he added lightly, like it was a helpful clarification. "I manage all of this." The agent nodded. Not agreement, acceptance. The system accepted it too. I could tell by the way the conversation tightened, how the language shifted from policyholder to account holder, and then, quietly, to just you. I wasn't asked anything. I watched the agent scroll through dates. I watched his cursor pause briefly at one line, then move on. I watched him type a note, delete it, then type something shorter. There was a calm pressure in the room, the kind that doesn't raise its voice but still closes in. Every sentence pushed the situation forward without me in it. "Since the cancellation was processed this morning," the agent said, "reinstatement would involve a review. There's a waiting period." "How long?" my husband asked. "Could be several days. Depends on underwriting." "That's fine," he said quickly. "We'll deal with it." "We." The word landed heavier than it should have. The agent continued outlining fees, reinstatement costs, adjusted premiums, a higher deductible if the policy was reopened. Numbers were mentioned but not lingered on, enough to establish consequence, not enough to invite discussion. I noticed something else then. Every form the agent referenced was positioned closer to my husband. Every confirmation request was phrased toward him. The system wasn't hostile, it was efficient, and efficiency has a way of erasing people quietly. I kept my hands folded in my lap. At one point, the agent glanced at me, just briefly. Not a question, more like a courtesy check. His eyes moved on before I could speak. "We'll need to finalize the lapse acknowledgement," he said. "Standard procedure." My husband reached for the pen. I watched the way his confidence held. No hesitation, no concern. He believed this was done. Final. The agent slid a form across the desk. It stopped just short of the edge closest to me. "This confirms awareness of the coverage gap and acknowledgement of the cancellation timeline," the agent explained. My husband scanned the page. "Okay." The pen hovered, then moved. I noticed the date field before anything else. I noticed where the signature lines sat. I noticed what wasn't there. I didn't react. The agent kept talking, outlining next steps as if the decision had already hardened into fact. My husband nodded along, occasionally interjecting with a confident, "Right," or "That makes sense." The pressure wasn't loud, it was procedural. It said, "This is how things work. This is already moving forward. You're late to object." I understood then that silence wasn't absence, it was placement. I was being placed outside the process without anyone saying it directly. When the agent finished, he gathered the documents neatly into a stack. The folder from earlier stayed separate, not prominent, not addressed. "Since this is processed," the agent said, "you'll receive confirmation by email." My husband stood, straightening his jacket. "Great, let's get it done." The agent paused, not enough to draw attention, just enough to register. "There is one thing," he said evenly. Both of them looked at him. He tapped the form lightly with his pen. This cancellation request references authorization. I just want to make sure the consent aligns. My husband's expression didn't change. It does. The agent nodded. Okay. No challenge, no confrontation, just a note made somewhere unseen. I watched him place the form back into the folder. I watched how carefully he aligned the edges. I watched how he didn't say anything else. As we turned to leave, I caught a final glimpse of the screen. Just a moment, just enough to see a field highlighted, not filled, just selected. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was incomplete. And I remembered exactly when that field should have been completed, and who had never been asked to do it. I walked out without a word. The printer never jammed. That's what stayed with me. Paper moved through it smoothly, page after page, as if nothing unusual had happened. No alerts, no warnings, just routine motion. The soft, mechanical sound of a system doing exactly what it was built to do. I stood there long enough to watch 3 documents slide into the tray before anyone noticed I hadn't moved. My husband was already halfway down the hall, speaking into his phone. His voice was relaxed, confident, the tone of someone who believed the matter was closed. Behind the counter, the agent was resetting her workspace. Tabs closed, screens minimized. The earlier pause had been filed away under review pending, a category that sounded neutral but carried weight I didn't need to name yet. I didn't ask questions, I didn't follow. I waited. When the agent finally looked up, it wasn't to address me directly. It was the polite glance people give when they're done with you but haven't formally said so yet. "You'll receive an update by email," she said. Not unkind, not warm either, just procedural. I nodded once. Outside, the afternoon felt brighter than it should have. My husband ended his call and smiled like someone who had just wrapped up an errand. "We'll deal with it later," he said, already reaching for the car door. "These things take time." I didn't respond. That silence wasn't passive. It was logistical. There was nothing left to say in that moment that would change the structure of what had already been set in motion. On the drive home, he talked about schedules, about deadlines, about how inconvenient it would be if coverage took too long to reinstate. He spoke as if the policy belonged to the same category as utilities or subscriptions, something adjustable, transferable, manageable. At a red light, he glanced over. "You don't need to worry about this," he added. "I've handled all the insurance stuff for years." I looked straight ahead. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the way it only gets after midnight, when even the appliances sound careful. I didn't start with the cancellation. I started with the beginning. Old policy documents, archived emails, payment confirmations, renewal notices. Every interaction I'd ever had with that insurer existed somewhere, recorded in neutral language that never anticipated intent, only authorization. I downloaded everything. The timestamps mattered. So did the phrasing. Primary policyholder, authorized signer, consent required. Those words hadn't meant much to me before. They were background noise, part of the administrative hum of adult life. Now I read them slowly, not emotionally, precisely. I found the original enrollment confirmation from years earlier. My name appeared first, not as a dependent, not as a secondary contact, as the policyholder. I didn't react to that either. I just noted it. Next came the payment logs. Monthly premiums pulled from a joint account, yes, but the payer name attached to the policy had never changed. It was consistent across every billing cycle. I compared that to the cancellation notice timestamped earlier that day. The language shifted again. The cancellation referenced account action initiated by authorized party. It did not specify consent. It did not include an acknowledgement from the policyholder. It assumed alignment. Assumptions are efficient. They're also fragile. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't label anything as wrongdoing. I just organized the data. Folders, dates, screenshots. By the time I shut the laptop, it was nearly 2 in the morning. I hadn't felt angry. I hadn't felt afraid. What I felt was something steadier, clarity. Over the next few days, my husband behaved exactly as expected. He joked about how long insurance reviews always take. He complained about paperwork. He reassured me repeatedly that everything was under control. He never asked what I was doing. When an email arrived from the insurance office confirming the review status, he read it aloud as if doing me a favor. He skipped sections, paraphrased others. There's just a delay, standard stuff. I noticed what he didn't read. The message referenced a compliance queue. It included a case number. It used the phrase pending authorization verification. I forwarded it to myself. That afternoon, while he was at work, I called the customer support number listed at the bottom of the message. I didn't identify myself as confused or upset. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I asked one question. What documentation is required for a full policy cancellation when the policyholder is not present? The representative didn't hesitate. Written consent from the policyholder or a legally recorded authorization on file. I thanked her and ended the call. No drama, no reaction. I checked my files again. There was no written consent, no recorded authorization, no digital acknowledgement from me. What existed instead was a process that moved forward because no one had stopped it yet. Systems aren't malicious, they just continue. The next morning, I returned to the insurance office alone. I didn't announce myself, I didn't demand updates. I asked for a copy of my policy history for personal records. The request was ordinary enough that no one questioned it. When the printout slid across the desk, I saw it immediately. A section had been flagged, not completed, not rejected, just marked. The field requiring policyholder consent had been selected but left empty. I didn't comment on it. I folded the papers neatly and thanked the agent. As I left, I noticed the same agent from before glance at the screen a second longer than necessary. She didn't look alarmed, she looked careful. That was new. At home, I placed the printout next to my other documents. The pattern was clear now, not obvious, but coherent. My husband came home late that evening, irritated about something unrelated. Traffic, meetings, delays. He barely noticed the stack of papers on the table. "They'll sort it out," he said again, loosening his tie. "These offices always do." I watched him move through the kitchen like someone certain the floor beneath him was solid. I didn't interrupt that belief, because by then, the policy record was already telling a different story. Not loudly, not conclusively, but enough that someone would eventually have to read it all the way through. And when they did, it wouldn't matter who spoke first. The soft hum of the office suddenly shifted as a new voice entered the room, a tone crisp, deliberate, entirely in control. The senior insurance officer walked in, tall, poised, scanning the floor with a glance that demanded attention without raising a hand. My husband's casual confidence faltered slightly at first, a subtle tightening in his shoulders, though he quickly tried to regain his composure. The agent, who had been meticulous yet distracted until now, straightened and started shuffling through a stack of documents with visible caution. I remained seated, hands folded lightly on the table, breathing steady. No reaction, just observation. Every movement they made, every hesitation, every micro-shift in body language was being cataloged silently by me. The room felt narrower, charged, like the air itself had thickened. The officer's eyes landed on the file my husband had submitted earlier. There was no introduction, no explanation. They didn't need it. The paper in front of them stopped the flow for a fraction of a second, just enough to make my husband shift his weight nervously. My heart didn't race. I noticed the pause and the slight arch of the officer's brow. The cursor on the screen hovered as if frozen by the sheer scrutiny in the room, and I realized that the procedural wall I had quietly anticipated was now real, standing firm between my husband and the claim he thought he controlled. The officer leaned in, voice calm but exacting, reviewing line after line of the cancellation request. Each paragraph, each signature field, each timestamp was scrutinized, not for theatrics, not for emotion, just factual precision. "Policyholder authorization?" the officer asked softly, almost rhetorically, not looking at anyone in particular. My husband's confident reply stumbled before it even left his mouth. He cleared his throat, tried to maintain the rhythm he had used earlier with the agent, but his words carried less weight. There was a subtle crack in his posture, a slight hesitation in tone that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less attentive. I leaned back, keeping my face neutral, letting the room's tension become its own narrative. The agent, who had so far been a background player in this slow unraveling, now followed the officer's lead. They checked each form, each digitally logged entry with renewed diligence. Papers were moved from one tray to another, stamps touched carefully to signify verification. The office that had once felt procedural but neutral now felt like a court of scrutiny, every movement deliberate, every sound weighted. I noticed a particular moment. The cancellation request had an incomplete signature. The field was highlighted, not filled. No one pointed it out immediately, yet the officer paused, tracing the line with a finger. My husband's eyes flickered toward the mark, and for the first time in hours, he was no longer the one controlling the narrative. "What about the policyholder consent?" the officer asked, calm, almost conversational, yet absolute. The words themselves weren't loud, but the authority they carried caused a ripple. The agent glanced at my husband, unsure, as if waiting for him to fill a gap that did not exist. My husband's jaw tightened. The casual dominance he had wielded before was gone. His hand lingered on the desk, no longer guiding or directing, just holding, futilely. I watched the officer methodically go through the procedures, invoking the review steps I had anticipated. Each protocol was followed exactly, cross-checking signatures, verifying timestamps, reviewing previous email confirmations, logging attempted cancellations. The efficiency was clinical, impersonal, and yet it carried a force far heavier than any confrontation. No yelling, no drama, just an unstoppable procedural tide that left my husband momentarily unmoored. I noticed him glance at me once, a subtle acknowledgement of the shift. No words were exchanged. He had assumed the system would obey his authority, his casual command over my policy. He had misjudged. I did not need to speak. I did not need to move. My preparation, my quiet collection of facts, my patient observation had set the stage perfectly. By now, the officer had found the final confirmation. The signature was missing, the authorization incomplete, the request procedurally invalid. The room's tension shifted from subtle uncertainty to an almost tangible tilt. The scale of power had shifted entirely. My husband's attempt to cancel, to control the outcome, was legally and formally undone without a single raised voice. The agent, now fully aligned with the officer's direction, began the corrective process. Documents were reordered, flags applied, and the system started reverting the cancellation. My husband's eyes darted between the officer and the agent, silent questions forming, but no words to articulate them. He had no foothold left in this carefully structured process. I remained seated, calm, every micro-expression cataloged. There was satisfaction in the quiet. The power wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, it was absolute in its correctness. Every verification, every system check, every procedural affirmation reinforced the invisible armor I had quietly constructed. Finally, the officer looked over the files once more, confirming the reinstatement. The signature field, previously incomplete, now dictated the legality of the policy. The officer's nod was subtle, professional, and unyielding. My husband slumped fractionally, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet, stunned realization. The authority, the procedure, and the law were immovable, and I had been ready, silently, all along. No confrontation, no yelling, no dramatics, just facts, procedure, and unshakable calm. The procedural wall I had observed, anticipated, and counted on had executed the reversal flawlessly. I felt the weight of control returning, not through anger or words, but through readiness, patience, and the immutable structure of authority. And as the officer finally left the room, the agent resuming their neutral routine, the shift was clear. The room, once dominated by my husband's casual assertion, now belonged to the procedural order I had quietly aligned with. My observation, my patience, and the quiet accumulation of evidence had transformed vulnerability into strength, humiliation into procedural triumph, and isolation into a stage for the inevitable reversal.
I didn't speak. I didn't react. I simply observed the restored balance, letting the authority carry the story to its rightful outcome. The silent strength, the meticulous preparation, and the immovable law had done their work. The reversal was complete, inevitable, and calm, a quiet triumph orchestrated without a single word.
The room had fallen into a hushed stillness as the senior insurance officer leaned back slightly, letting the gravity of the situation settle. All eyes were on the documents laid neatly before them, each page reflecting months of policy history, amendments, and authorizations. The cursor blinked steadily on the digital system, paused precisely where the discrepancy had been discovered, the missing signature. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to notice it, but it carried the weight of the entire dispute. The husband, who had walked in with absolute certainty, now sat rigid, his confidence noticeably shaken, his hands unconsciously fidgeting with the edge of the chair. The agent's posture shifted too. For the first time, procedural caution replaced habitual passivity. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just the slow, undeniable assertion of order and fact. The officer began to speak in calm, deliberate tones, each word measured, carrying authority without a trace of aggression. Upon review, the policy record indicates that the authorization signature is absent. The requested cancellation cannot be executed under these circumstances. The policyholder's consent is required for any modification or termination. There was no emphasis on the husband's error, no finger-pointing, but the statement itself carried an implicit verdict. The narrator felt a quiet pulse of validation, a long-buried tension releasing as the institutional framework she had been quietly observing finally aligned with her perspective. Every action in the office seemed choreographed to maintain balance and clarity. Documents were routed through the proper channels, system entries updated in real time, and verification steps executed with precise attention. The husband attempted to interject, a faint protest in his voice, but it was met with a calm procedural response. The officer noted the steps required for compliance, citing policy rules and regulatory obligations. There was no argument, no emotional flair, only methodical confirmation of facts and authority. Each action emphasized that control now rested in the system, not in arrogance or assumption. The narrator remained seated, poised and composed, yet internally every micro-detail resonated with a sense of triumph. The silence that had once symbolized her isolation now felt protective, a shield forged from patience, observation, and knowledge. She watched the office personnel execute each corrective step, seeing the husband's body language gradually change, slight hunches, tightened jaw, eyes darting toward the official documents, silently acknowledging the shift. The agent, who had previously enabled the imbalance through casual deference, now moved with deliberate precision, reinforcing the procedural rigor the narrator had long anticipated. The final confirmation came in quiet authority. The officer carefully tapped through the system entries, each click a measured assertion of fact, and then looked up, eyes meeting the narrator's with neutral acknowledgement. The policy was reinstated, fully active, legally intact, and recognized solely under her ownership. The husband exhaled subtly, a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance passing across his face. The narrator allowed herself the smallest, imperceptible nod, a quiet internal acknowledgement of justice achieved. No words were necessary. The procedural correction, the unassailable logic of the system, had spoken louder than any argument could. As the room gradually returned to normal routine, the narrator reflected briefly, but firmly, on the journey. The silence she had maintained, the careful attention to detail, the patient observation, all had culminated in a victory that was clean, absolute, and entirely justified. Authority, law, and patience had neutralized the arrogance and control that had once seemed insurmountable. In this quiet aftermath, she recognized the enduring power of diligence over confrontation, process over chaos, and knowledge over assumption. Finally, as the office settled into its typical rhythm, she allowed a single, calm thought to anchor the conclusion. I didn't argue. The policy spoke for me.
No triumphalism, no dramatics, just the quiet satisfaction of order restored, rights affirmed, and dignity preserved. The experience had left an indelible impression that strength is often silent, victories are most powerful when understated, and control, once respected, must always be wielded with careful attention to law and procedure.